Alright guys, welcome back to the channel. It's a pleasure to be with you today again. I'm using my camera phone to tape this video today. I hope it's good enough. I think the microphone on the phone is going to be better than the camera, so let me know in the comments below if you like it more or if you prefer the Nikon audio better. Either way, I guess the video is not as important here as much as the audio. So what I'm planning on doing over the next 3 weeks is providing you with a video on each of the sections of the LSAT, specifically the logical reasoning, the reading comprehension, and the analytical reasoning. I will be starting off with the logical reasoning because I think in a normal circumstance, you would have the logical reasoning section comprising of essentially 50% of the exam. So with that being said, we'll start off with the logical reasoning, and then we'll move over to reading comprehension, and then we finally will finish off with analytical reasoning, which is also known as the logic games. Let's dive right into it. So I've developed 5 top tips. Before I start the tips on the logical reasoning, there's 2 other things I really want to highlight. The first one being that anything you can do in the interim period while you're preparing for the LSAT that is going to improve your ability to reason is going to be advantageous for the LSAT. If you undertake activities that can improve your working memory and your short-term memory, that's going to result in an improvement in your LSAT score. So generally speaking, any intelligent test looks at your short-term memory and your working memory and tries to determine how good you are at that, right? Essentially, how many different elements can you hold in short-term memory, the different relationships between those elements, how can you manipulate them? And that's essentially what the LSAT is testing as well, a lot of that, right? Whether you're dealing with logical reasoning where the elements are more abstract, or you're dealing with the games where the elements are, you can visualize them because they're a set of numbers or a set of letters. So the tip, I guess the pre-tip, the bonus tip, is that I found a game very helpful myself. It's the go and back game. It's essentially a little square, and you have to track a pattern between both visual representation on the board and then also auditory. There has been studies. Again, the science isn't conclusive on this. It hasn't been substantiated fully, but there are some studies that show an improvement in people's ability to comprehend and an improvement in the intelligence scores, and also short-term memory and working memory improvements. So I think there's definitely some merit there. In order to get the benefit of it, you need about 20 minutes a day. For 3 weeks is what they did in the test, but I would suggest, for your period while you're training for the LSAT, do 20 minutes of this a day every day, and see how far it gets you. After a month period, if you're not seeing any results, if you don't feel like you're doing better, then maybe think about cutting out of your training. But for me, it was helpful, and I think it might give you something to think about. I will post links to that in the information below. If you feel like investigating, trying it out, please do so. So now moving on to the actual tips that I have prepared for the logical reasoning. I think the biggest tip that I can give to you is always focus on the STEM first. So when you're looking at a question, you're going to see a stimulus in the logical reasoning. You're going to have a stimulus, then you have a question stem, and underneath there are going to be the answer choices. Definitely focus on the STEM first. The first step that when you're attacking a logical reasoning question is to read the STEM, analyze the STEM, and figure out in which family of questions does it fall into, because there's going to be a number of set question types that they use, right? You're going to have strengthened questions, you're going to have weakened questions, you're going to have find the flaw, you're going to have main point, conclusion questions, you're going to have parallel reasoning, there's going to be assumption questions. They're big on the LSAT, including depending on who you discuss, there's different ways of qualifying them, but essentially they're necessary assumptions, insufficient assumptions. That book I linked, the Power Score book, they call sufficient assumption questions justified questions, but it doesn't really matter what nomenclature you use to classify them. Ultimately, it's just being able to determine right off the bat what question type you're dealing with, right? So that's why it's good to read the STEM first, understand what you're going to be analyzing in the stimulus, and then once you know, you move over to the stimulus. Step number 2, once you're done analyzing the STEM, you're going to move over to the stimulus. Now, the stimulus is either going to have a conclusion or it's not going to have a conclusion. If it has a conclusion, it will have premises, maybe intermediary conclusions that serve to substantiate the conclusion. It could be a chain of premises. It could have some assumptions in there as well that are not stated, which is what you're going to try to figure out in an assumption question. But that's going to be if it has a conclusion. On the other side, it could not have a conclusion. If it doesn't have a conclusion, it's usually just a number of random facts they're connected in some way, but they're just facts that are being provided to you, and you're going to have to figure out what can be extrapolated from those facts, right? So more of, there's that distinction there. You're going to, right off the bat, you want to figure out what you're dealing with, and that's going to help you attack the question better. So like I said, if there's a conclusion, you're going to have to also familiarize yourself. I'll add a link on the bottom. Actually, I'll just put them in the description of conclusion indicators, premise indicators, and then also what they call counter premise indicators, which can also serve as conclusion indicators, especially on the reading comprehension part. So conclusion indicators are therefore, hence, consequently, right? Anything that indicates that there's some conclusion, right? For this reason, right? That's saying that whatever's coming next is the conclusion of whatever preceded it. And then premise indicators are because, since, for example, for the reason that, right? All of these are indications that this information is going to be used further on to form a conclusion, right? And then counter premise, or again, could be served as conclusion indicators in certain circumstances, are words like however, still, admittedly, whereas, on the other hand, right, despite. These are all words that help you understand what element of the argument each individual segment or sentence is playing. Another thing I want to mention is the importance of visualization as you're going through the stimulus. It's going to help you, and not only in the stimulus for the logical reasoning, but also for reading comprehension, because visualizing is a great way to remember information. I know that a lot of people who compete in memory games and memory championships, they use mnemonic techniques to remember a lot of numbers, or a lot of letters, or a list of things. And the way they do it is by visualizing where those specific elements are and putting them in certain places in that palace or house or whatever. As humans, it's easier for us to remember in those circumstances. So as you're going through the stimulus, try to visualize what's actually happening, because I think for me personally, it really helped crystallize what I just read, right? And it makes you do something else that helps you from getting distracted. So visualize, think about, let's say there's an economist and he's doing something, or he's making a statement about the city budget and how certain circumstances are going to make the city budget increase, and then from that he's drawing a conclusion, and then you have to find the flaw in his reasoning. Just picture an economist making these statements, and picture a city, and picture the budget and money flowing out. All these things, as you're doing it, it's going to really help you internalize it, and I think it's going to help you improve your score. I know it helped me tremendously, because I had some difficulty focusing on the topic at hand, right? Sometimes I would read a passage and I won't remember what I read, but focusing on this visualization really helped me retain that information. So I think that's a great tip that goes hand in hand with analyzing the stimulus. And then finally, I really want to highlight how important, again, English is, and understanding what each in sentence diagramming and grammar is as you're going through this, because it's super important to understand what each individual word is doing within the framework of the stimulus. Remember that. That's a huge tip, and it's going to be even more so relevant when you get to law school, because I'll tell you now, going through law school myself right now, way harder than anything I did for the LSAT, right? Way harder. Analyzing cases, understanding the principles of law, how you can apply them in different circumstances, working in the facts in there, way more complicated. So trust me, it's going to be helpful in the long term, not just in the short term for your LSAT. And that's the same with that double end back game that I told you about, a dual end back. All of those things. I'm trying to help you guys get more mileage out of the activities you do. Not necessarily just for the LSAT, but if you end up doing something else, it's going to help. Tip number 3 is, as you're going through the stimulus, really focus closely on modifiers. Again, I wanna hit that really hard, because modifiers can really change the meaning of a sentence, right? And they use quite a bit of them. Quantity modifiers, probability modifiers. On the quantity side, you have things like all, some, not all, a few, several. All of these are ways for them to qualify the statement, right? To add more detail. On a probability side, could, maybe, would, can, will, right? All of the modal verbs are usually there, and focus on them, underline them, understand what they're really trying to say to you in a specific circumstance. Also, I will do a video on formal logic and conditional logic as well, but in formal logic, there's a discrepancy the way certain words are perceived in the LSAT than they are in the real world, right? If I tell you some of my friends are coming to a party, you're not going to think that all of my friends could come to the party. But on the LSAT, some can mean as few as one or all of them, right? It's just the way formal logic works. So keep that in mind. And it's the same word on the negative side, right? If you say some are not, right, all of them could not be there, right? But you wouldn't think that when you just read it the first time, some are not coming. You think that at least one or two came, but no, not necessarily, right? Maybe not all were there. Essentially what it's saying is at least some are not, but maybe all are not as well. So keep that in mind. This is really important. Those distinctions as you're going through it. Underline words that modify nouns, adjectives, even in certain circumstances, underline adverbs, right? Because they're modifying the adjectives or the verbs that are integral to the meaning of the sentence. That's tip number 3. Again, I'll do a video on conditional reasoning and formal logic as well to give you a little more background on those topics as well. Tip number 4 is something that I think a lot of people don't do, and maybe you shouldn't necessarily do it all the time on the exam, because on the exam you can waste a lot of time, but when you're actually going through practice, paraphrase answers. Before you even look at the answer choices, paraphrase some answers. Think about what could actually be going wrong, right? If the question is what's the conclusion, you should have a pretty good idea before you get to the answer of what the actual conclusion is, right? To look at the way the different elements of the sentence work, look at what's a premise, what are the different premises, what's the conclusion, is there an intermediary conclusion? Just think about all those things before you actually go look at the exams, right? Have an idea in your mind of what the answer could be. If it's a flaw in the reasoning, again, you should be able to decipher that simply by looking at the stimulus. You wouldn't need to actually look at the answers. And sometimes what will happen is you look at the answers and the answers can confuse you more. I know it's more work to paraphrase. I know it's something that you don't want to do. We look at the easy way out, and sometimes you can get away by just looking at the answers. But get in the habit of trying to create your own answer, and see how close you can get to the actual answer. Again, you don't want to be doing this on the actual exam to that extent, because you can waste time, right? But it's good in practice to do so. It will become a heuristic for you when you're on the exam, and you'll be able to move through the exam quicker. And then the 5th tip, I think it's really important for you to understand that you can do really well on the exam without getting a perfect score. And I talked about that in my video when I did a logical reasoning. I ended up getting 1 wrong on that exam. And usually, if you look at statistically speaking, in order to get in the 98th percentile, 173, you're averaging about 2 per section wrong. And in certain circumstances, 3, right? You need a 92 on average to get a 98th percentile, or 173 out of 101, right? So you can get 8 to 9 questions wrong, depending on a test, and still get a 98th percentile score. If you wanted to get into a 165, you need to get, I think it was 19. You could get up to 19 wrong, which is quite a bit, right? Like if you think about that, that's 5 wrong a section, and one section you get 4 wrong. So that's a lot of wrongs. Do not be intimidated if a question doesn't make sense. You can always just guess on 1 question, 2 questions, 3 questions even, and still get a really good score, as long as your accuracy is high. So tip number 5 is definitely relax, don't stress, and then as you're going through the answers, try to eliminate the ones that you don't think are worth it quickly, right? And you will get much better as you practice, right? Off the bat, don't do that, but as you get better, try to get into a flow where you can pick out a question and say this is the wrong question right away. Because even on the hard questions on the LSAT, there'll be certain answers that are completely off the mark, right? At least 2 of them will be completely off the mark on every single one, right? You can look at it right off the bat and say, every single question, you can look at it and say, these 2 are just totally gone. The harder LSAT questions that I've encountered, the most of the difficult ones just have 2 that are close. But some of them, the really difficult ones, have 3, right? And I think if you have 3 that you think are right, then you're probably doing something wrong in the analyzation part. And again, that's another thing that I want to stress. If you go through the answers and none of them look right, don't just keep going through the answers, right? Realize that there's something you've done wrong in your analyzation of the stimulus, right? In order for the answers not to make sense, there's something you missed. Go back to the stimulus, look at it, and then go back to the answers. Again, on the LSAT, on the actual LSAT, if you're short on time, don't waste time, don't do that, just guess. but on the practices, take your time and try to go through them. And you saw when I went through the exam myself, there's certain cases where both answers are really close, and you really are just guessing, right? There is a right answer, but they qualify the question with which one of these is most likely to be relevant in the circumstance, or to be close to the answer. And most likely, it's difficult. It's difficult because the language is not like mathematics, where it has an actual value. It's not concrete in that sense, right? It's not like a function with one value. Language is in its nature very ambiguous, right? We have concepts that are quite broad, they're not distinct, they're not easy to define. And there's the denotation part of a word, and there's also the connotation, and there's some interplay between those. So when you hear a certain word, what it means to you might be very different than what it means to me, and that's why there's that inherent difficulty with language. So again, realize that sometimes you're gonna have to guess, and you can still get a really good score even guessing. So I think those are the 5 tips that I want you to take away. With the other stuff that I talked about in the beginning, focus on that dual and back game. Focus on that. I think it's helpful. And also definitely read the grammar books that I have, especially now if you're just starting, you're planning on doing it in the summer. You have plenty of time to get your knowledge of English up, because like I said, when you get into law school, you're going to need to know English much better, and it's really important in anything you do, right? Whether you're drafting, later on in work, depending on what you do, maybe you're not going to want to be a lawyer. Maybe you'll get your law degree, you're going to end up doing something else, right? Or maybe you want to get into a different business. Having strong, firm grasp of English, of synthesizing sentences, of understanding sentences, of understanding what the individual parts do, it's going to be helpful. It's going to be really helpful to you. Trust me. So with that, I'll sign off. Thanks for listening to the video. I'll do 2 more videos now coming up in the following weeks. I've been a little bit, again, started school, so it's really busy. I got a memo due, a fact I'm due next week as well. So I'm going to try to do my best to come up with these videos. And please let me know if you like the sound on this phone, if it's good, if it's not. I might just use my Nikon again if it's better for you. I don't know if the video is better or worse on the phone. I'm trying to use the Pro mode here. It's a Note 5 Ultra. Supposed to be good camera, but you let me know. Okay? Thank you.